Welcome, everybody, to the Nordic Model. Welcome to the interview. Today, we're here with returning guests David Sligar and Ben Spies-Butcher to talk about the Australian election that just happened. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to you guys. You guys just do a little bit of a quick introduction and what you're working on, and then we can get right onto it. So, David, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, my name's David Sligar. I'm a policy analyst. I've got a background in Treasury and Finance departments focusing on social and economic policy. I've worked as a Labor advisor in sort of central offices for a former treasurer and a couple of party leaders at the state level. I'm now a researcher, a research student at Macquarie Uni on social policy, particularly welfare state, particularly focusing on the interaction of welfare state and labour movement politics. And I teach here as well.
Perfect. We can pass it to Ben.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Ben. I'm an academic here at Macquarie University as well. I've been involved in the Greens party here for quite a while, including as the co-convener of the Australian Greens some years back. And I do a bunch of research around the welfare state as well, particularly on the financing of social policy.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you guys again for agreeing to come on the show. Really excited to have you. So yeah, let's just kick it off. Let's break down what happened in the 2022 Australian election. I think both of you guys are relatively pleased with the results, so let's start with that.
Yeah, I think, well, the single biggest story of this election is the decimation of the main Australian Conservative Party. The main Conservative formation for government in Australia is a coalition. We call it the coalition. It's made up of the Liberal Party, what we call the Liberal Party, which is just mostly your classic centre-right party, like Conservatives in the UK or the Conservatives in Canada. It can be a little bit confusing to North Americans when they hear the word Liberal. There's the and they're in a coalition with the National Party, which is a kind of rural agrarian farmers interest party. The Liberal Party, it's difficult to understate the destruction that has been done to the Liberal Party at this election. This is the dominant This is the dominant party of government. The party that has, I think it's somewhere between two-thirds. Ben, you might have a better stat than this, but 2/3 to 3/4, somewhere in that vicinity of government in the 20th century of Australia, and there's been a major realignment at this election. Essentially. A little bit of back history. Australia, early 20th century, was broadly similar to the UK and even perhaps Canada in some ways, I suppose, in that there was, well, the two major parties then were a kind of centrist Liberal Party and a conservative further right party. The Labor movement came, Australia got heavily unionised, Australia had the first Labor government in the world. This terrified the non-Labor parties in Australia, and they unified. They literally put aside their differences. At one point, one of the right-wing parties was called the Free Traders and the Protectionists, and they united, literally opposing ideologies just because they were shit scared of the growing Labor, of the power of the Labor movement in Australia. And then they also united in a coalition. Those two became the Liberal Party, and they united in a coalition with the National Party. And that has been the hegemonic leadership of Australia. The Liberal Party has, even though it's a conservative party, it never fully got rid of that kind of more centrist liberal side. They just started to have a smaller and smaller role in the party, while the Liberal Party pushed more into the kind of cultural right-wing stuff, the kind of wedge politics, the nationalistic stuff, some anti-immigration sentiment. In Australia, most recently, they were trying to do some anti-trans sentiment, some stoking fears about China. And they also had extremely problematic on gender, and there are all these kind of sex assault and harassment scandals. All that kind of the centre liberal side of the Liberal Party, which was grounded in the affluent seats, the really wealthy seats in Australia, the sort of seats that the Democrats win in the US, the affluent suburban seats. They were held on to strongly by the Liberal Party in Australia. This election, they lost them all. That is their heartland. That is where Liberal prime ministers came from. That is where Liberal treasurers came from, even very recently. And it's gone. And a new movement has formed. Loosely grouped independents, we're calling them the Teals because they're a mixture of green politics and classic blue is the Liberal colour in Australia. And they were pushing action on climate change. That was what they were particularly disaffected about. And they were pushing integrity in government because there was big corruption issues, and also gender politics. This government was notoriously bad on, there's a rape meters away from the Prime Minister's office in a ministerial office. And following that, it emerged there was this systemic culture of harassment and bullying and sexual assault in Liberal Party ranks. That was a major deal. And the Teals were led by almost exclusively professional women. And they took all the classic Liberal seats away. Now the Liberal Party is decimated. And also, and Ben will talk more on this, very good night for the Greens as well.
Yeah, sure. Right to you, Ben.
Yeah. So, I mean, just in terms of getting an idea of the numbers, probably for you folks in Canada who don't follow our politics that closely. So it looks like there will, still late counting, and we're not quite finalised yet, but it looks like Labor will have a very slim majority. So probably a majority of one seat, maybe two or three. But there's the Liberals have got that coalition has got its lowest result since the Second World War. And that's the first election it ran in. So, having been formed out of the conflagration of the Conservatives once before, after that fusion that David was talking about, their first outing didn't go as well, and they've just done as badly as any time between that. So there's this now very large crossbench, which Australia is unused to. We don't have the more proportionalised politics that you have in Canada. Even though you don't have a proportional system, you've kind of got this proportional parliament that's based on geography. And in some ways, this is an election that moves Australia closer towards that Canadian model. So we have a crossbench that's at least 15 people in the parliament of about 150. So that's quite sizable. 9 of those people in the end will look like those Teal independents, effectively a new Liberal Party in a sense, although they are still structured as independents. They don't have a party structure, but they certainly coordinated in a number of respects during the campaign. They've already suggested they're now going to run as a configuration in state politics in Australia too. And there was an expansion of the Greens vote and seat representation as well. So we have a lower house, which is single member, and the Greens broke through in 2010 and have had one member for a very long time, and now have at least 3, maybe 4 members in the House after this. The additional members came from one of the most conservative states in Australia, from Queensland, a state that is still very, has a majority of conservative MPs, even after this result, and is traditionally the stronghold of that National Party, the agrarian conservatives, rather than that smaller liberal bit of the Liberal Party. And that was concentrated in the city of Brisbane, as you probably imagine, the bit that looks a little bit more cosmopolitan. And this is a big win for both the kind of the cosmopolitan centre and the cosmopolitan left, and around an agenda which was environmentalism, climate change, taking climate change seriously, as well as gender politics seriously, and transparency and, kind of anti-corruption. So that is a very big shift. Probably most surprising for me is that emerged out of the tactics of the Conservatives, not out of wedge politics from the left. So the Conservatives doubled down on effectively a Trumpite strategy and have imploded themselves as a result. And that's driven by internal dynamics within the Conservatives, much like is going on in the United States, where they are moving further to the right because of their own internal pre-selection processes. But unlike the US, where at least there's a mass base of people who really are Trumpists and who vote in primaries, the Australian system is dominated by party structures with almost no members. And so the Liberal Party is moving to the right because of a tiny number of people who have taken over the branch structure and who are driving the party to the right where they don't have an electoral base. There isn't a mass base of support, and that is what's caused this disconnect between where the party leadership is and where these Teal candidates who come in and just appeal directly to the base of the Liberal Party and bypass its institutions and leadership. And that's also driven by the geography of Australia. And I mean, a little bit more like Canada, but even more extreme, is that Australia is extraordinarily urbanised. So the bits of Australia that look like small town America are a tiny fraction of our seats. And the bits that look like the big cities are the vast majority. So this is a strategy that was designed to appeal to small town America, that was taken into an electorate where if you got all of those people to vote for you, you get 30% of the seats. It really was quite bizarre. It looked bizarre going into the election, but the Conservatives have been dominant here for so long, you kind of felt, well, maybe they know something we don't, and this is going to work out for them. But it didn't, and that is a very, very serious break. It's also worth noting we have a proportionally elected Senate. It's based on states. It's not strictly proportional, but roughly. And there, the Greens will hold a large chunk of seats. It won't be possible for the Labor Party to pass legislation without the Conservatives or the Greens. And it looks like we're edging towards Labor and the Greens, with maybe another progressive independent being able to control the upper house as well. So this will be a very progressive parliament by Australian standards, one of the most progressive in its history, and a very, very fragmented and fractured right.
So it seems like good news for all of you. The Greens got something from it. Labor obviously won an astounding victory and a huge splintering of the right. And so, David, one of the things we talked about in the last pod was that there was never really a consolidation of kind of left-wing rule in Australia. And Ben, you just said, okay, now we have the most progressive government. So what can you guys look forward to in the future in Australia as a left? Like, what kind of policies are we going to see? What's exciting for you?
I mean, I have to give the kind of bland, boring answer at the start, which is first and foremost, I'm excited that the Conservatives do not control the agenda in Australia. And that agenda-setting power of government, nothing will happen for the left, nothing will happen for the left of centre unless we can control that and gradually move people on side. Australian media is particularly particularly right-wing, heavily dominated by Murdoch, plus a couple of other quite conservative entities. They played opposition against Labor the whole election. The only way that can be countered, and opposition against the Greens as well, but because Labor's the party that's going to be forming government, they tend to focus on Labor. That has to change. That's the first step. Albo, as is known, Australians love to shorten things. Everything is E or O on the end. Albo, it's ScoMo, it's Scott Morrison. Albo had a very small target agenda. He He played, he tacked right up to the kind of centre, it's fair to say. We spoke about in the last podcast about how, like, for Australian standards, it was quite, or Anglosphere standards at all. The last Labor campaign, 2019, we were expected to win. It was quite bold. We had a large suite of tax reforms, complex tax reforms and tax hikes to take away some of the loopholes that, upper middle and upper class. We just ditched all of them. We have a stronger climate change policy than the Conservative government did. There's a meaningful difference there in terms of our target. Having said that, it is not. It's not of the scale needed, for a suitable Australian policy to combat climate change. But my favourite policy, I'll tell you my favourite policy. My favourite policy as a welfare head is eliminating, there was this system of income management where Australia's not like the US in that we don't have food stamps, but gradually our welfare system started to get taken over by this income management approach where you had a welfare card and 50 to 80% of it you could only spend on at selected retailers for good things like groceries, like food. And the details varied. There are a couple of different cards and the details varied from card to card. Labor pledged to get rid of that, which, that's, I would say that's quite a large transformation, and it's also quite a significant change from Labor policy not very long ago, where the last Labor government, unfortunately, pushed it a little bit and pushed things down. There was the major community concerns about. There were big scandals about involving Indigenous communities, and there was a lot of public consternation about things being, there was a child abuse issue, and there was a major child abuse scandal, consternation about how alcohol was being spent and pornography and so on. And, very bad welfare policy, and Labor should never have gone down that. But they've completely abandoned it. That didn't get a whole lot of mainstream press coverage, but for me is one of the boldest policies. It kind of emerged out of a bit of a funny scare campaign where the Conservatives once again were hoisted on their own petard. They really wanted to play up how they were rolling this out, because they don't want to say this is this horrible paternalistic punitive thing. The spin is, this is good for people. And then if you go down the line that it's good for people, you want to play it up, and you want to talk about how you're expanding it and how you're expanding it across the welfare system and community. And they gave just enough little bits of fragments of stories about mass expansion of this card that, all the deserving welfare, quote unquote deserving welfare recipients, the age pension welfare recipients, it allowed Labor to run a scare campaign that might be expand across the age pension. It was classic scare campaign stuff, but it wasn't without a fragment of truth. Also, there were already age pensioners on the card. Usually, they were the ones who were more vulnerable, more deserving. But absolutely, I think the coalition probably would have wanted to. They were going to expand it, and age pensions, as we know from the last episode, our discussion, are not a sacred species in Australia. The last government tossed, cut 300,000 age pensions and tossed 100,000 off it altogether. So people were right to be worried. And I think as part of propelling that campaign, Labor just said, and also because of Indigenous voices that influence the Labor Party, we're just abandoning this card. So that's my favourite part. Also, there's from a kind of Nordic model perspective, kind of market socialism perspective, we have a very small, it's quite small, it's $10 billion investment fund that we've proposed to create. And the proceeds from that investment fund will go towards funding social housing. So, it's on a very small scale, a kind of People's Policy Project Brunigism, Meidner plan, but on a very small scale. But I personally think, and that can be scaled up. If that's working, that can be scaled up. They're my two favourites.
On to you, Ben.
Yeah, so taking up the welfare issue, I think one of the most interesting dynamics in the parliament will be its a real shift towards diversity. Australia has an extraordinarily monocultural political elite and media elite, which is overwhelmingly white and very male. And one of the shifts that's happened in welfare, I think David's right, has come from a lead in a shift within the Labor caucus to have more Indigenous folk in the parliament. This parliament will have more Indigenous representatives than any in the past, and across all of the parties, although most of them on the left. There's also going to be a record number of people of non-European ancestry, although still tiny numbers compared to Canada and most other Anglophone countries. And there's going to be a record number of women. In fact, there might even be a majority of women in the lower house, because every single one of those small L Liberal Teal independents is a woman. Although they're all also white. So it's kind of almost, caricature white liberal feminism, but nonetheless, it is very profound shift away from a very misogynistic culture.
And David Pocock. A rugby player. There was one man, a rugby player.
One man in the upper house, yeah. That has profoundly shifted Labor's approach to welfare issues. I think the fact that there are Indigenous members who are directly connected to the communities that are punished by those policies has made it untenable for Labor, I think, to continue with the forms of paternalism that they kind of got wedged into by the Conservatives earlier on. And I think we might see some other reforms that emerge in different approaches to politics that come from the fact that there are people connected to very different communities. So that, I think, is going to be really exciting. I also think David's also completely right that this is a very modest offering from Labor by even the standards of previous Labor victories. It's still a centre-left agenda, and there are still some quite exciting things in there. But this is pretty modest by the standards even of Hawke, but certainly of Whitlam at the other Labor governments going back a bit. But I also think there might be a new dynamic emerging that partly comes from the proportionalisation of politics, where it is possible for Labor governments to become modestly more progressive once in office, which used to be the exact opposite dynamic, where Labor governments came with relatively progressive agendas. They gradually conservatised in office. It became harder and harder to govern. They moved more and more to the centre. But if we look at the last Labor government from 2007 to 2013, very unusual because there's a minority government for the second half of it, but most of their big reforms are in the second half. The NDIS, the paid parental leave scheme, the changes to climate policy, which included a substantial increase in social spending as compensation for folk as well. So I think there is potentially that dynamic. And I think it comes from a reorganisation of the left, where there is now a party outside of the Labor Party that's also on the left that creates the possibility of electoral competition in Parliament that's not disciplined by the overwhelming desire to maintain office. That comes with some real risks as well. So there is a very profound risk for the right of politics, which has already been realised, that they've lost, not only have they lost 9 seats, which is a lot, their seats have basically always held whenever they've formed government. So it's hard to get, like, just to do the arithmetic to say how are you going to form government without those kinds of seats. But they're also the seats that raise the most money because they are the richest seats, right? This is the very heart of financial capital in Australia has been ripped out of the Liberal Party. So that's going to be, and it's hard to see how they go back because all of the people who are moderates just lost their seats. The party room of the Conservatives is now much more conservative. The incoming leader is likely to be much more conservative than the outgoing one. That's a profound dilemma. On the left, it's a far nicer story, but I think there is a medium-term tension in the dynamics between a Labor Party, which I'm confident will try to sideline the Greens and work with these Teal independents to be able to prove that it's not too dangerous and to establish a long-term governance agenda. And the kind of radicalisation that's likely to play into, where the Greens will obviously have a very strong interest in being able to play up the very modest offerings from Labor, the possibility of much more, and I think to win seats on that basis and potentially to shift the agenda on that basis. If that does kind of left flank, it might be possible for Labor to move into a more progressive position while still appearing to be a fair distance from the Greens. And the Greens here have transformed from an environmental post-materialist party to really a Green New Deal party that is solidly the most left-wing party on the welfare state now, not facing the same tensions that Labor does as a party of government. So I accept that. But you look at the platform of the Greens, it was a Green New Deal in the sense of massive investment in industry policy, as well as shutting down fossil fuels, but putting a massive expansion of universal healthcare to include dental and mental health, which is excluded for some bizarre reason from our universal health system, to make free childcare, to build 1 million homes, mainly social, publicly owned housing, but in a somewhat market socialist model as well. Elements of which you can see in Labor's model at this very reduced scale, as David was saying. So this is, I think that those dynamics are going to be really interesting. They have the potential, I think, to fundamentally transform Australia if we can get a decade of progressive governance that drifts to the left, where the conversation is drifting even further to the left. But they also have the potential to destabilise left governance and lead to a collapse, which is more or less what sort of did happen in the last Labor government. So how we work that through, that's something we're going to be thinking through. But we've got a few years to do it because we're in a pretty comfortable position.
No, I think it's definitely a very exciting position because here in Canada, the Liberal government held an election last year. Didn't go the way they wanted it. They were hoping to get back into majority rule, but it was kind of back to the status quo. And so basically the left-wing kind of Social Democratic Party here, which is the NDP, the New Democratic Party, they're the kind of balance of power because the Conservative Party obviously won't vote for the center-left policies. And recently they were able to strike a deal to like keep on upholding government. And I think it's an exchange for also broadening our kind of universal healthcare system, which is not really universal. It only covers about 70% of expenses. So we might get kind of pharmacare, mental health care included, just as a factor of having this left-wing party in the balance of power. So I think it's definitely very possible, like even seeing it here, it's definitely possible for Australia. So as both of you have kind of said, like, okay, like, even though it's good to have this kind of left-wing government in power, the initial offering seems to be pretty modest in terms of policy. So I guess I have kind of two questions based on that. One is, how would you like to see them build upon this kind of modest offering of policies that they're doing? And two, do you think that this, and I know this is looking forward way into the future, but do you think like this kind of offering of policies is enough to merit an electoral victory in the future for the left? And let's start with Ben this time.
Yeah, so I think that that dynamic I was talking about is the kind of best outcome, that we have an agenda-setting Greens that opens up new space to move into, I think there is actually a coalition of forces that includes the Teals, that liberal group, around, you might say, degendering, or the gendered aspect of the welfare state and of work, of refashioning social reproduction and potentially ecological reproduction in a way that directly addresses gendered inequalities. So things like childcare, parental leave, the education system in general. Labor has already made announcements about amending industrial relations legislation to try and address the gender pay gap, to reorganise our paid care leave system, but also in terms of the minimum wage. And interestingly, the minimum wage became a big election issue in the last couple of weeks, where the media, for some reason, seemed to seize on a comment by Labor's leader, Anthony Albanese, saying that he supported an increase in the minimum wage in line with inflation to not have a real wage decline. And that was seen as a horrible gaffe for reasons I'm still completely uncertain of, because he was unable to manage the economy and was running off at the mouth and didn't know how complicated all these things really were. But I mean, I think in retrospect, it played remarkably well. It forced the Conservatives into a position where it looked like they wanted to cut real wages. And an increase in the minimum wage, addressing casualisation and gig economy work. I think there'll be a lot of pressure from unions to do that. There's clearly a majority in Parliament that can pass that. And we're talking about a lot of feminised workers, and that's exactly how Albo presented it. You know, he was talking about, these are the people who got us through the pandemic. These are cleaners. These are, you know, kind of nurses' aides and other people who helped us get through. We need to make sure that we don't leave them behind. So I think there is a real kind of material agenda around all of those things, around social and ecological reproduction, the basis of the Green New Deal, that plays into the politics and the configuration of the Parliament to unite Liberals, Greens and Labor in an agenda which hopefully can be kind of ideologically led by the Greens, but I think parliamentary numbers-wise increasingly driven by the Labor Liberal Teal alliance.
Yeah, just I should have, in terms of what Labor's already committed to. Labor is already committed to quite a significant improvement in a universalising direction of childcare. It's not full-blown universalism, and it's not full-blown kind of national. It's certainly not nationalised childcare, as I would very much like to see, but it's a significant softening of means testing. And I think Ben is absolutely right that is that's an agenda which the Teals love. And I know, because there's a Teal candidate in my polling booth who obviously targeted my partner as a potential voter and just with a child, and just started going right into that. And that's a big issue for professional women and professional families in Sydney, in urban centres of Australia. Childcare sucks so bad in this country. It is extremely expensive, hard to acquire, and frustratingly means tested. Just going back, the other point I would like to make about changes that Albo has already committed to. There'll be a big change in approach to Indigenous representation in the Australian with the changing government, and quite a different approach to cultural issues as well. There won't be the dog whistle, anti-China kind of stuff that was very toxic. And there'll be a nice confluence of interests here, as Ben said, between Labor Party, the Greens, and also the new kind of the new Liberals, the Teals, as we call them. That'll work quite nicely together. And integrity. The last government had a major problem with corruption. it was quite rampant. They promised to set up an anti-corruption commission. They never did. That was a major issue. That was a major issue for all three of those entities, Labor, the Greens and the Teals. I know it sounds modest, but in the scale of Australian politics, where we got to, improving competency, ending the corruption, ending the culture war, kind of just the nasty wedge politics. That will already be a huge achievement. I agree with everything Ben says. I think there's scope for universalizing of the welfare system, particularly along those where that interacts with feminized concerns. Childcare, we're already moving in that direction. Labor, the last Labor government, supposedly kind of a neoliberal government, but they introduced the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which has dramatically increased funding for disabilities. It's now the second, after funding to the states and the age pension, it is now the largest program in the entire Commonwealth government. That started from nothing under the former Labor government. It's a facet, and it's a universalist scheme. Again, going against some of the traditions of Labor, of welfare in Australia. And no one, few people predicted when that first came up. Few people predicted that Labor government would introduce one of the largest social or any policy in funding terms, and it's really changed people's lives. So those kind of like universalistic welfare approaches, I think, Labor's been moving in the direction of kind of expanding Medicare to dentistry, which is a complete farce. It's a complete farce that dentistry is exempted from it. All those kind of areas, I think there's a lot of scope for kind of modest strategic universalization. One barrier that we're facing is taxation. And as part of Labor moving away from that big picture campaign of 2019, which the opposition, the coalition targeted them on, and the media targeted them on taxes. Unfortunately, they've kind of hemmed themselves in on committing to, just kind of Biden style signaling that they're not going to do much taxes. There's still work that can be done there. I think they can, for example, rely on bracket creep. Bracket creep actually increased tax collection under Rudd and Gillard, the previous government, reasonably substantially. Then once it increases, they can do a tax reform where they improve efficiency, and they say we're replacing this income tax with another more efficient form of tax, and it can look like a one in, one out, no higher tax exchange, but actually, thanks to bracket creep, the taxation has been steadily lifting. I think they can do nuances like that. Something else they did for the NDIS was introduce basically a flat levy on income tax. So they increase income tax to pay for a major welfare scheme. For a reasonably anti-tax country, pretty much no one objected to that. This across the board increase in income tax. They haven't, to my knowledge, ruled out that sort of thing, at least if it's framed as not a classic income tax, but a levy. I think there are there's corporate tax. There's a lot of corporate tax breaks in Australia that they're committed to closing. I think they can do more on targeting taxation of very wealthy Australians. certainly the Greens have some policy in that space. And I had one more.
Can I add one more?
And one more. Well, no, let
both of you can add
Ben
one.
jump in. Let Ben jump in.
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so one of the reasons that Labor is said to have lost the previous election was this big tax agenda. And a lot of that was closing tax loopholes, really. So it was loopholes around the capital gains tax and other things. I actually think that the Teals open a real opportunity to reform that in a way that avoids the scare campaigns, partly because most of those tax concessions, and this is a strategy that has worked in the past with Labor governments, particularly driven by the women's movement, which was very powerful in Australia in the 70s and 80s, that highlights that those tax concessions are very strongly gendered, right? They all go to rich blokes. And I think making that argument will open up some space to say, well, look, we just need to wind this back a bit. We can't give quite so much money through what are very inefficient forms of concessions that encourage speculation and so forth. We already have a decent capital gains tax in place. It's just got holes in it. And plugging those holes, I think, is the easiest and quickest way to a wealth tax in Australia. And I think there's a kind of a feminist argument that can be made for it that allows the Teals really to give the Labor Party cover to do it. And that can be linked directly to funding that expansion of the kind of welfare state we're talking about. So I certainly see real opportunities to being able to do that. I think that's going to be a relatively technocratic politics, a successful one, but a pretty technocratic one. And one of the things will be how to balance that amongst the demands, particularly, I think, from younger voters who feel completely alienated from the system, can't afford housing, have now tens of thousands of dollars of student debt when they rack it up, in these very precarious jobs where they're often not paid at all as interns for large periods, that they're going to want something bigger. That is the core base of the Greens. And being able to mobilise all those constituencies together, I think, as I say, that's a big challenge, but a possible one to navigate, I hope.
Just jumping in on that, I think Ben's right on kind of some optimism for some sorts of tax reform on the Teals, and the gender side and playing to the feminist concerns, the feminist issues are no doubt important. I think there's a kind of hard material reality here that these Teals have won the absolute wealthiest seats in Australia, and a lot of them have actually firm commitments against those 2019 Labor tax reforms, and their base are the wealthy elite. So they're going to, the gender argument might be very nice, but they're not going to want to lose those seats. And part of the reason that they're winning these seats that you've got to realise, the Liberals held them by the Conservative Party held them by massive margins. And they held them by massive margins despite the fact that they were on the nose for, the social conservative issues, because they could rely on them to uphold their wealth issues of, their interests of wealth and privilege. So there's going to be some, there's going to be some scope, but I just temper that a little bit. And I think that's where the kind of like tax switch comes in. You have to make the tax increase a little bit kind of disguised. So you let bracket creep run up for a while, then you say, we're just doing a one-in, run-out tax reform where we're swapping income tax for, some other kind of other form of tax after you've already let it increase covertly.
So I agree with what David just said. So I'm certainly not suggesting that the 2019 agenda in whole will go through, but I think elements of it can. And what the two things I think are useful to reflect on is those same seats swung to Labor in 2019. So at the height of this scare campaign, the scare campaign actually didn't hit these uber wealthy seats very much. The realignment that we've seen in this election began at the last election. So that's not to say that they'll just go, yeah, that's fine. But I think it means there is some at least wiggle room to move And I think we'll see incrementalism rather than radical reform. But these are enormous concessions. So you can kind of go 10% of the way and get a lot of money. So they're the kinds of things that I think we're likely to see. But I also think there needs to be a direct trade-off. And one of the real mistakes of Labor in 2019 was to get a big bucket of money by closing tax loopholes and then spending the bucket of money on things completely unrelated to the tax loopholes. All of the instances where this has worked before, it's worked. We got universal healthcare by closing tax concessions for private health insurance. We got family benefits by closing tax concessions for dependent spouses. But in both those situations, there was a one-to-one trade-off. We said, we're going to close a tax loophole in this area and we're going to fund a universal service provision in exactly the same area. So I think you would need to see things like the retirement income system being wound back in order to expand the pension to the middle class by reducing means testing, for example. Those kinds of trade-offs that still do benefit the upper middle class, they just don't, like most of these tax concessions, they really do just benefit the top 0.5%, right? They're very, very, very top weighted.
Who live in Wentworth?
I don't know what that means.
who live in one of the seats, the Teals one, Bondi, like very a seat of wealth and privilege in Sydney. The richest seat in Australia. They lost. It was an iconic Liberal seat, blue ribbon Liberal seat, as they call it, gone now to these new Teals. I would add one more kind of maybe kind of rabbit out of the hat. I think there's some scope for looking at family payment, moving towards more universalism in family payments. Now, historically, the Labor Party, as we went through on the last episode, introduced these means testing for various rationales, which was to target, yet at the same time they did tax concessions and so on. But now the Labor Party has observed this kind of constituency of professionals, a lot of professional women who need childcare. Now, the means testing of childcare, the problem is not literally withholding the childcare. It's all it's means testing, essentially a welfare payment that funds the childcare. Now, if you think that kind of contradicts the whole Labor Party means testing obsession, even though it's a service, it's not actually withholding the service, it's just withholding the money. So Labor, as it's tried to pivot down this path, is then caught in a bit of a double bind because it's spent like 40 years bashing means tested welfare. So you get Labor's had to really push this line. Oh, no, it's not welfare. Childcare, it's not childcare subsidies, it's not welfare. So that's kind of how they square the circle at the moment. But they're also running this big kind of argument about productivity and so on, and labour market participation. And that labour market participation is grounded not in anything special about childcare, but effective marginal tax rates. It's not the childcare, it's tapering down the funding. Guess what that is identical to? That's exactly the same argument against means testing family payments, against means testing child benefits. And it doesn't, at the moment, there's kind of this like brain compartmentalism where you put one in one box and one in the other box. And one's just like this welfare payment to mums to look after their kids, and the other one's like this good profession, about working women and getting out. They're the same. It's a fiction. And it's not going to take long, I think, before people will work out that the same argument extends over to universal family benefits. At least I will be pushing that.
Okay, fair enough.
If I have anything to do with
it. I do see that we're running close to the end of our time, but I had, two questions for you guys. One, I think, which is the most important question of the night. And then second is a wind-up question that we like to do with all our guests. The first one is that, the Cricket World Cup is happening in November 2022. what do we think about Australia's chances right now? Because I would really like to see India lift the cup again, and I'm not too I'm not too bullish on Australia's chances.
Look, I grew up in the golden age of Australian cricket, and where Australia basically couldn't lose, and that's my childhood, memories and everything. It's like the Garden of Eden has just been tarnished by a world of sin, and so I've just detached. It's too scarring. It's too traumatic for me. So I'm miserable. I'm depressed. I can't give you a good answer to that question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Women's Soccer World Cup is about to be played in Australia and New Zealand. And, I don't know, maybe we can get our cricketers back on the straight and narrow. Again, after the rioting that was going on a little while ago, I'm also not hugely optimistic, but there's still a very strong appetite for it here. So it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm really glad that you could have this astonishing left victory, so you can kind of be okay with the loss you're going to face in the Cricket World Cup. So that's good. But anyway, yeah, this last question I really enjoy asking to all our guests, and it's an individual question. So if you could beam one central tenet of Ben Spies-Butcher or David Sligar thought, one really important policy point that you want everybody to be on the same page as you as, what would that be? And let's start with Ben this time.
Yikes. Look, I think my experience in the Australian left is, how can you get the folk who know how to run the state well, who are often quite technocratic and can find clever solutions to problems, how can you build solidarity between them and the movement folk who build the political energy that's necessary for change? And when those two groups talk to each other well, we tend to win and get things done. And when they don't talk to each other well, we tend not to, for one reason or the other. So I think it's certainly one of the reasons that the challenges I see coming up, and hopefully we'll be able to manage it.
David?
Means testing is a tax.
That we're familiar with.
That's it.
Yeah, no, I totally do agree. We talk ad nauseum about, and a lot of your articles come into play too when we're trying to explain this. But yeah, we're totally on the same page on that. Anyway, thank you guys so much for taking the times out of your busy day to do this. I really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of this kind of nascent left in Australia. And I think there's some wonderful things that are going to come from it. So best of luck to you guys.